The battlefield was supposed to be silent now, but silence never came. Smoke still drifted lazily over the broken skeletons of buildings, carried by the wind that whistled through the hollow ribs of concrete and twisted rebar. The man crouched behind the half-collapsed wall, his hands trembling against the blackened steel of his rifle, his ears ringing from hours of deafening gunfire that still haunted the inside of his skull. He thought it was finished. The push had ended 2 hours ago, their lines had advanced, and command radioed that the enemy was broken, scattered, retreating into the hills. He had believed it. He wanted to believe it. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, every nerve begged him to lower his weapon and let go. He had seen his friends torn apart in the mud, burned in the armored carriers, lost in the smoke of the assault. And yet, somehow he was still breathing. He sat there with lungs full of ash and fear, telling himself it was over, that he had survived, that maybe this time, finally, he could stand and walk away without looking over his shoulder. But the war never really ended. He knew that. The land itself told him so. Every street, every ruin, every charred doorway seemed to breathe with the ghosts of ambushes past. His name was Sergeant Cole Maddox, and though he wore the uniform of a man trained to kill, deep inside he was tired of being hunted like an animal. His unit had been cut to pieces in the last offensive. The armored column that was supposed to break through had been ambushed by dug-in anti-tank guns, and the air support that promised to cover them never arrived. He had fought through hellfire with a dwindling squad, dragging the wounded and leaving the dead, until the survivors were scattered in the smoking carcass of a city that had no name left on any map. Maddox had learned long ago that battles ended on paper far earlier than they ended in reality. High command declared victories when the maps showed red arrows pushing forward, but on the ground, men still bled, still screamed, still died. And now, sitting there with sweat soaking through his body armor, he listened. The quiet was too thick, too unnatural. Somewhere beyond the haze, he could swear he heard the faint clatter of boots, the metallic cough of a rifle being chambered, the whisper of movement in the rubble. He pushed himself tighter against the wall, the rifle steady in his grip, his heartbeat pounding louder than the ringing in his ears. The city smelled of cordite, blood, and dust, the unholy perfume of a war zone that never cleansed itself. His visor was cracked, a smear of blood dried across one side. He couldn't remember if it was his or someone else's. His comms had gone to static after the last blast, and he hadn't heard another friendly voice since. That silence weighed heavier than any wound. He forced himself to breathe, counting seconds, trying to convince his shaking body that he wasn't alone, that reinforcements were somewhere out there, that maybe a convoy would roll in and pull him out of this graveyard. But the city had swallowed too many promises already. And then it came, the sound that froze his blood before he could even rationalize it. A voice, sharp and guttural, barking orders in a language he knew too well. Enemy soldiers. The ones who weren't supposed to be here anymore. He had been told they were finished, shattered, incapable of reorganizing. Yet the echoes of their boots grew louder, bouncing off the alleyways, carrying closer. Maddox's fingers curled around the trigger. His pulse raced. He had a split second to decide, stay hidden and pray they passed him by, or fight and die with at least one of them falling beside him. His instincts, honed by months of trench raids and ambushes, screamed that these men weren't searching randomly. They knew survivors were still here. They were hunting. His mind screamed at him to keep still, but his heart betrayed him. He leaned the barrel over the shattered edge of the wall and peered down the smoke-choked street. 5 of them. Shadows in the dust, rifles slung, armor streaked with soot, helmets glinting faintly in the dying light. They moved like predators, silent but sure, scanning the ruins with patience that only killers carried. Maddox's breath hitched as he realized the truth. These weren't stragglers. These were the last wolves of a shattered pack, and they weren't retreating. They were counterattacking. His finger twitched against the trigger. He could kill 1, maybe 2 before they cut him down. A lonely, useless death on a street no one would ever care about. He hesitated, his chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes. And that was when the distant growl reached him. A sound so low, so primal, that for a moment he thought it was thunder rolling over the horizon. But thunder didn't rise in pitch, didn't carry that metallic shriek, didn't sound like the rage of a steel beast waking from slumber. His heart stuttered as recognition hit him. It was an engine. Not just any engine, the unmistakable roar of twin turbofans tearing across the sky. He looked up, eyes straining through the haze, and his soul clenched with a mixture of disbelief and relief so powerful it nearly broke him. She was coming. The A-10 Warthog. He had heard it scream before in other battles, in other nightmares. The soldiers on the ground called it the voice of God, others called it the angel of death, but Maddox knew it simply as salvation. Its ugly, brutal silhouette was hated and feared by every enemy that had ever faced it. A flying tank, a machine that turned the tide when everything seemed lost. And now, against every promise, every delay, every absence that had cost him friends, it was here. Her bird. He didn't even need to see the markings to know who flew it. Captain Laura Kane. She had saved his unit once before, carving a path of fire through ambushers that would have annihilated them. He hadn't seen her in months, but the sound of that beast's engines was enough to tear open old memories and burn them fresh again. The enemy soldiers heard it too. Their heads snapped toward the sky, panic flashing through their composure. They weren't the hunters anymore. Not now. Maddox tightened his grip on the rifle, a savage grin breaking through the exhaustion on his face. The battle wasn't finished. Not yet. Not with her in the sky. The first scream of the Gu-8 Avenger cannon shattered the air like the voice of a god breaking through the clouds, and in that instant the battlefield transformed. Maddox pressed his back against the wall, teeth clenched as the thunderous growl rolled over him. It was not just a sound, it was a physical force that vibrated in his bones, rattled the steel in his weapon, and sent tremors through the earth beneath him. He knew what that meant. Somewhere above the haze, Laura's warthog had locked onto the enemy positions, and now nothing in its path would survive. The enemy soldiers who just seconds ago moved like confident predators suddenly scattered, their heads snapping upward, their nerves betraying them. Maddox could see it in their posture. The way their rifles drooped, their formation crumbled, their feet stumbled over debris. They were no longer hunters. They were prey. The first line of tracers stitched the street, glowing lines of molten fury that ripped through the concrete and flesh with merciless precision. The sound was like no other, not the stutter of an assault rifle, not the bark of a machine gun, but a drawn-out metallic roar that lasted seconds and seemed eternal, like a chainsaw tearing through the heart of the city itself. Dust erupted into the air, sparks cascaded from shattered steel, and two of the enemy soldiers disappeared in a mist of blood and armor fragments before they could even scream. The others dove for cover, but there was no safety, no shelter strong enough to defy the wrath of the Avenger cannon. Maddox felt adrenaline slam into his veins, igniting something he thought was long dead. For hours he had been drowning in despair, half believing that survival was a mistake, that he was just one unlucky breath away from being buried with the rest of his squad. But now, as the roar of the warthog raked across the battlefield, he felt alive again. His hands steadied, his vision sharpened, his heartbeat no longer a burden but a drumbeat of war. He watched the survivors of the enemy squad stumble into a shattered storefront, dragging one of their wounded, desperate to escape the wrath above. Maddox leaned out from the wall, his rifle raised, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of his shots joined the orchestra of destruction. One of the enemy soldiers fell, clutching at his throat, blood spraying across the doorway. Another returned fire, bullets snapping inches from Maddox's head, but their panic betrayed them. Their aim was wild, sloppy. Maddox ducked back, grinning through gritted teeth. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, he believed. Above, the warthog screamed past, low and heavy, its engines vibrating the air like thunder rolling across metal. He caught only a glimpse through the smoke, a dark gray shape, wings bristling with ordnance, painted shark mouth snarling across the nose. It was ugly, brutal, beautiful. Laura had always joked that flying the A-10 was like strapping yourself into a flying anvil with a cannon bolted to the front. Maddox remembered the first time he met her during a joint operation, how she had walked into the briefing room with her helmet tucked under one arm, blonde hair pulled back, flight suit streaked with oil. She had the kind of presence that commanded attention without needing to raise her voice. And when she spoke, even the grizzled ground pounders listened. She had said one thing that stuck with him forever: "When you hear my gun, don't duck, move forward. Because if I'm shooting, they're running." Now those words echoed in his skull, and he knew she was right. The enemy was breaking. He could feel it in the rhythm of the battlefield, the way their fire sputtered and their courage bled away under the relentless assault from above. Maddox rose from cover, his legs weak but steadying with each step, his rifle raised as he advanced down the street littered with shattered glass and smoking debris. Every breath was fire in his lungs, every heartbeat thunder in his chest, but he moved because she was up there, because she had not abandoned them, because the fight was not finished. A rocket shrieked overhead, the tail flame cutting through the smoke like a comet, before it slammed into a building across the intersection. The explosion ripped the structure apart, showering the street with rubble and fire. Maddox threw himself to the ground, the blast wave rolling over him like a tidal wave of heat and dust. When he lifted his head, Ears ringing, he saw the remnants of an enemy machine gun nest reduced to a crater, the weapon bent and useless, the bodies of its crew scattered like broken dolls. The warthog curved overhead again, banking low and tight, a beast hunting its kill with merciless patience. Maddox pushed forward, crawling behind a burned-out vehicle before rising to a crouch. He could see more enemy forces farther down the avenue, at least a dozen, maybe more, rallying, trying to mount some kind of defense. They had heavy weapons. He could see the long tubes of their launchers glinting in the firelight. A sick knot twisted in his gut. An A-10 was tough, built like a flying tank, but it wasn't invincible. If they got a lock on her, if they fired in coordination, even Laura's bird could be torn from the sky. He couldn't let that happen. Not to her. Not after everything. He checked his magazine, half empty. He dug into his vest, pulling free his last 2 reloads. That was all he had left. No grenades, no backup, no squad. Just him, a rifle, and the angel of death screaming overhead. He chambered the next round, exhaling slowly. His fear was gone now, burned away by the roar of engines and the memory of his fallen brothers. In its place was purpose, sharp and unyielding. If the enemy wanted to drag her down, they would have to go through him first. The street ahead erupted again with the sound of the Gu-8, a line of tracers cutting the enemy formation to ribbons. Maddox rose with the rhythm of the cannon, firing short controlled bursts into the survivors, cutting down one then another. His body moved without thought, a machine fueled by desperation and duty. Bullets cracked past him, one grazing his shoulder plate, sending a jolt of pain through his arm, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every second he bought was another second Laura had to finish them, another chance to break the enemy before they regrouped. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw her bird dip lower, impossibly low, skimming rooftops as it lined up another run. For a heartbeat, time froze, and Maddox caught sight of her cockpit glinting in the fading light. He imagined her eyes scanning the ground, calm and sharp, her hands steady on the controls. She wasn't just flying a machine. She was wielding it like a blade, and every stroke carved salvation for the men below. The thought ignited something deep inside him, a fire that roared louder than fear. The enemy tried one last stand. A pair of shoulder-mounted launchers rose from the ruins, their operators locking onto the Warthog's path. Maddox saw the telltale glow of their targeting systems, saw the rockets flare as they launched skyward. His body reacted before his mind could process. He sprinted into the open, firing until his rifle clicked dry, until the operators fell sprawled across the rubble, their rockets streaking harmlessly into the sky, missing wide. The recoil bruised his shoulder, his lungs screamed for air, but he had done it. He had saved her. The Warthog screamed again, unleashing its fury across the enemy's last holdout. Fire and steel consumed the avenue, shaking the earth, blinding Maddox with dust and flame. When the smoke cleared, the street was silent except for the crackle of fire and the groan of collapsing rubble. The enemy was gone. Maddox collapsed against the husk of a wall, chest heaving, body trembling. His rifle hung empty in his hands, his last magazine spent, his strength nearly broken. But his eyes lifted skyward, tracking the gray silhouette banking wide above. For a moment he thought she would leave, vanish back into the clouds like a phantom, just another ghost of war. But instead, the Warthog dipped its wings once, a deliberate gesture, a salute. His throat tightened. She knew he was here. She had seen him. And in that instant he understood something deeper than survival. The battle wasn't over, not for him, not for her, not for any of them. It would go on tomorrow and the next day and the next. But as long as she screamed across the sky, as long as he could raise his weapon and move forward, there was hope. The city smoldered like the carcass of some ancient beast, every alleyway coughing black smoke into the darkening sky, every shattered building glowing with the red pulse of hidden fires. Maddox's chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, every breath scraping like glass against his lungs. His rifle lay across his knees, useless now, the last round fired and spent. He had nothing left but the sweat-soaked weight of his body armor, the ache of his bruised shoulder, and the iron will to stay alive long enough to see what came next. The silence was different now, no longer that suffocating dread of waiting for death to step from the shadows, but an empty echo, the stunned quiet of enemies who had been broken and scattered. He had seen it before, that moment after a storm when the world held its breath, not in peace, but in disbelief at the violence it had just endured. Above, her Warthog circled like a hawk claiming the field. The engines thundered, fading and returning with each pass, the sound a constant reassurance that he wasn't alone. He tilted his head back, squinting through the haze, watching the ugly, beautiful beast carve its path across the clouds. Each pass was lower, slower, as if she were searching for something. He knew she was. She was searching for him. He couldn't explain how, but he knew. Laura Kane had always been the kind who never left anyone behind, the kind who would fly through hell itself to pull a soldier out of the fire. Maddox had only fought alongside her a handful of times, but in war, that was enough to forge bonds stronger than blood. He reached to his belt, fumbling for the flare he had been saving for this exact moment. His hands shook with exhaustion, slick with grime, but he forced his fingers around the cold cylinder. He lifted it, pressed the striker, and with a violent hiss it came alive. A plume of red fire roared into the dusk, a burning signal stabbing upward through the smoke. Maddox staggered to his feet, holding it high, the crimson glow painting his battered armor, the shadows of ruin flickering across his face. He waved it in wide arcs, his throat raw as he screamed wordless cries up into the sky. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he needed her to see. He needed her to know he was still here. The Warthog banked hard, engines howling as it tilted in a sweeping arc. He saw the cockpit flash in the dying light, a brief glint of glass. Then the nose dipped, and the aircraft descended lower than before, dangerously low, skimming rooftops, trailing smoke in its wake. Maddox's heart slammed against his ribs as he realized she had seen him. The bird roared directly overhead, the hurricane of its passage nearly ripping the flare from his hand, the downdraft pelting him with dust and ash. He stumbled, but he held on, the light blazing defiantly in the gloom. A voice crackled suddenly in his ear, faint, broken through static. His comms had been dead for hours, and at first he thought it was a hallucination, another cruel trick of exhaustion. But then he heard it again, clear this time, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Ground unit, confirm identity. Repeat, confirm identity." His throat tightened. He fumbled for his earpiece, pressing it against his ear, his voice breaking as he tried to respond. "Sergeant Cole Maddox, 5th Battalion, still alive." His words tumbled out in a rush, as if saying them faster might keep them from being stolen by the static. There was a pause, a burst of interference, then her voice came back. "Come. Steady. Strong. Maddox, I see you. Hold position. I'm not leaving without you." His knees nearly buckled, a surge of relief washing through him so strong it was almost pain. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself upright, gripping the flare like a lifeline. "Copy, holding," he rasped, though every nerve in his body screamed for him to collapse. The Warthog circled again, its silhouette framed against the blood-red horizon. Maddox knew she couldn't land here, not in the middle of this ruined city, not with rubble choking every street and fire licking at the sky. She would have to guide him out, cover him until he reached some semblance of safety. The thought of moving again, of dragging his body through more miles of death and ruin, nearly crushed him. But when he heard her voice again, softer this time, he found the strength buried somewhere deep inside. "There's a clear zone 3 clicks west. Open ground. If you can make it there, I can get you out." 3 clicks. Under normal conditions it would be nothing. But with no ammunition, no squad, no support, and enemies still lurking in the ruins, it might as well have been across the ocean. Still, he nodded to himself, eyes narrowing. Understood. She must have sensed his hesitation, because her voice came again, firmer now, that tone he remembered from briefings, from the times when orders weren't requests but lifelines. "You can make it, Maddox. I'll be on you the whole way. No one touches you while I'm in the sky." Her words settled into him like steel. He turned, squaring his shoulders toward the west, his flare sputtering low but still burning. His boots crunched against broken glass as he stepped out into the street, each step heavy but deliberate. His legs screamed protest, his body begged for rest, but he forced himself forward. Above, the engines howled again, Laura's bird pacing him, its shadow flickering across the ruins. The first gunshot came from the right, snapping against the pavement near his feet. Maddox dropped instinctively, rolling behind the burned husk of a transport vehicle. His rifle was useless now, nothing but dead weight. He cursed under his breath, gripping the flare like a knife, the absurdity of it almost laughable. Then above, the Gu-8 spoke again. A single burst ripped through the building where the shot had come from, the concrete disintegrating into dust, the sniper's perch collapsing in an avalanche of rubble. Maddox blinked through the haze, a savage grin breaking across his face. She had him covered. She really did. He pushed onward, moving from cover to cover, every shadow a threat, every flicker of movement a potential ambush. Each time the enemy tried to strike, the roar from above silenced them, the Warthog's fury obliterating rooftops, alleys, entire squads before they could draw a bead. It was a dance of survival, man and machine moving as one, her wings shielding him, his steps guided by her presence. And though exhaustion dragged at him, though his muscles felt like lead, there was a fire inside now, a relentless drive that carried him forward. Minutes stretched into hours, or at least it felt that way. His world narrowed to the rhythm of his footsteps, the roar above, the endless ruins sliding past. Once, he tripped over a corpse half buried in dust, nearly falling face-first into the rubble. The dead man's eyes stared up at him, wide and glassy, the insignia of his own unit still clinging to the shredded uniform. Maddox swallowed hard, forcing himself not to look, not to remember. He could mourn later if later even came. For now there was only movement. Finally the ruins began to thin. The city gave way to scorched fields, open ground littered with craters and the skeletal remains of burned-out vehicles. The sky above was a smear of orange and black, the sun a dying ember on the horizon. Maddox staggered into the clearing, every step now a battle against the weight of his own body. He collapsed once, catching himself with bloodied palms, dragging himself back up through sheer will. And then he heard her voice again, steady as ever. "Almost there, Maddox. I'm bringing her down." He lifted his head, vision swimming. Ahead, through the heat haze, he saw it, a stretch of cracked highway relatively clear, long enough for her to touch down. His heart pounded as he realized what she was doing. The A-10 wasn't meant to land in places like this, not without support, not without safety. But she was doing it anyway. For him. The engine screamed louder, closer, shaking the ground as the Warthog descended. Its landing gear extended, dust and debris whipping into a frenzy as it hit the asphalt in a spray of sparks and smoke. The beast roared and rattled, skidding across the broken road before grinding to a halt. The canopy popped open and he saw her at last, helmet off, hair whipping in the wind, eyes scanning the field with the same unyielding fire he remembered. "Move, Sergeant," she shouted, her voice cutting across the distance like a whip. Maddox forced his legs to obey, stumbling forward, each step agony, each breath fire. He crossed the last stretch in a blur of pain and determination, dragging himself up onto the wing as her hand reached out to grab his arm, pulling him toward the cockpit. For a moment their eyes locked, hers fierce and alive, his ragged but burning with gratitude. No words were needed. Everything was said in that one look. And then the engine surged again, the bird straining to rise, and they were moving, lifting off the scarred highway into the blood-red sky. The cockpit was smaller than Maddox remembered, a cramped coffin of steel, switches, and glass that roared with the fury of engines straining against gravity. He collapsed into the second seat, his chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes as the canopy slammed shut above them, sealing the two of them inside. Every nerve in his body screamed for rest, but there was no time. Laura's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon, throttling the bird forward, wrenching the stick as the Warthog clawed its way into the blood-red sky. Dust trailed behind them, the highway vanishing in a swirl of fire and smoke as they lifted into open air. Maddox's ears popped with the sudden shift, his vision tunneling as the ground fell away beneath them. For a heartbeat he thought he might black out, but Laura's voice anchored him, sharp and steady over the roar. "Stay with me, Sergeant. Don't you dare pass out now." He turned his head, forcing his eyes open, staring at her profile in the glow of the instrument panel. She was exactly as he remembered, jaw set, eyes like steel, hair pulled back beneath her helmet, but harder now, weathered by months of war. Her flight suit was streaked with grime, her gloves blackened at the edges, but her movements never faltered. She was a warrior sculpted for this machine, as much a part of the Warthog as its rivets and wings. Maddox felt a surge of something he couldn't name, relief, admiration, gratitude, all tangled together in the pounding of his heart. "I thought," his voice cracked, his throat raw. He swallowed, tried again. "I thought you weren't coming." Laura didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, her hands steady. "I almost didn't. They cut my sortie twice, grounded me," said the sector was clear. "But I knew better." She flicked a switch, the engine's pitch changing, the bird leveling as they cleared the ruins. "When I heard your battalion got chewed up in that push, I didn't wait for clearance. I took the bird and went." Maddox stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She had defied orders, risked her career, maybe even her life, just to come back for him. For a moment, his chest tightened, the sting of tears burning his eyes, but he forced them down. There was no room for weakness here. "Not yet." "Then you saved my damn life," he said, his voice low, raw with truth. She glanced at him then, just for a second, and in her eyes he saw the flicker of something softer than steel. You saved yourself. I just gave you cover. The moment passed quickly. Ahead, the sky wasn't clear. Maddox saw it, dark shapes rising from the east, cutting across the haze like vultures circling the carcass of the city. Aircraft. Enemy fighters. His stomach turned to stone as the realization hit. The Warthog was a beast against ground targets, but in the air it was slow, lumbering, built like a tank with wings. Against fast movers it was vulnerable. Laura, he rasped, pointing through the canopy. We've got company. She saw them instantly, her jaw tightening. Her hands moved over the controls, adjusting altitude, throttling back slightly. 3 bogeys. Maybe 4. Looks like they'd been waiting for me. She clicked her comms, her voice calm but firm. Maddox, strapping tight. This is gonna get ugly. The harness dug into his shoulders as he pulled it tight, every instinct screaming that they had just escaped one death trap only to fly headlong into another. The fighters were closing fast, sleek black silhouettes armed with missiles that could swat the Warthog from the sky with ease. Maddox's pulse hammered in his ears as he gripped the edge of the seat, watching Laura work. She didn't panic. Her breathing was steady, her hands fluid on the stick, her eyes scanning the sky with predatory focus. The first missile lock warning screamed across the cockpit, a shrill alarm that sent ice through Maddox's veins. Laura reacted instantly, banking hard, the G-force slamming him against the seat. The world outside spun, a blur of smoke, fire, and sky, before stabilizing as the missile streaked past, detonating in the distance with a blinding flash. The shockwave rattled the canopy, but the bird held. Jesus Christ, Maddox gasped, gripping the harness so hard his knuckles went white. Laura didn't flinch. That was a warning shot. They'll be sharper on the next one. She dove, the engines roaring, the bird skimming low across the ruined landscape. Maddox's vision blurred, his body pressed against the seat as the Warthog hugged the terrain, weaving through the skeletal remains of factories and half-collapsed towers. Tracer fire streaked past from above as the fighters hunted them, their cannons tearing into the ruins, showering the cockpit with sparks. Can we outrun them? Maddox shouted, his voice nearly drowned by the roar. Not a chance, she snapped back. But we can outfight them. He stared at her, disbelief flashing across his face. In this? Against them? Laura's lips curved into a grim smile. They think this bird is slow. They forget it's also unkillable. As if to prove her point, the second missile slammed into the ground behind them, close enough to rattle every bone in Maddox's body. The Warthog bucked, alarms blaring, but Laura wrestled it back under control, banking sharply into a canyon of broken steel. The fighters screamed overhead, overshooting, forced to loop around for another pass. Maddox's breath came in ragged gasps, sweat dripping down his temples. He wanted to close his eyes to block out the chaos, but he couldn't. He watched her, the way she moved, the way she became one with the machine. She wasn't just flying, she was fighting, every twitch of her hand, every press of her boot a strike against death itself. Talk to me, Laura, he said, forcing his voice steady. Tell me you've got a plan. I've got a plan, she said, her eyes narrowing as the targeting reticle danced across the HUD. Make them come to me. Then bleed them dry. The fighters reappeared, cutting across the sky, their sleek bodies gleaming in the firelight. They dove, weapons armed, their cannons spitting fire. Laura yanked the stick, the Warthog rolling onto its side, skimming so low Maddox swore they scraped the ground. The tracers passed above, missing by meters, sparks raining down as the fighters screamed past. And then, in a move that seemed impossible, she pulled the bird up sharply, the Gu-8's nose locking onto the tail of the nearest pursuer. Hold on, she barked. The cannon roared, its voice drowning everything else. The sky lit with molten fury as a river of rounds tore through the fighter's fuselage, shredding metal like paper. The enemy aircraft disintegrated mid-air, a fireball scattering debris across the horizon. Maddox's heart slammed against his ribs as he let out a hoarse cheer, adrenaline surging. One down, Laura muttered, already banking into the next maneuver. The others weren't shaken. They closed in tighter, missiles locking again. Alarms screamed, the cockpit a symphony of warning lights. Laura cursed under her breath, diving again, weaving through ruined towers that jutted like jagged teeth into the sky. Maddox's vision blurred, black edges creeping into his sight as the G-forces hammered him, but he refused to pass out. Not now. Not when she was fighting like this. Another missile streaked toward them, closer this time, its smoke trail cutting across the sky. Laura waited until the last possible second before pulling a brutal roll, the missile sailing past and detonating against the ruins. The shockwave rattled the bird, panels shaking loose, alarms shrieking, but still she held it together. "Laura!" Maddox shouted, his voice breaking. "The bird can't take much more." "It'll take everything I give it," she snapped, sweat glistening on her brow. "So will I." The fighters circled again, relentless, predators refusing to give up their prey. Maddox's chest heaved as he scanned the sky, panic gnawing at his resolve. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in a machine that wasn't meant for this fight. And yet, when he looked at her, he believed. She was unshakable, unbreakable, her will carved from the same steel that armored the Warthog. The third fighter swooped low, lining them up, its cannons flashing. Sparks erupted across the canopy, shards of glass spraying into the cockpit. Maddox flinched, throwing up an arm, but Laura didn't waver. She twisted the stick, the bird rolling into the fire, not away. The maneuver threw the fighter off balance, forcing it wide. In that instant, Laura let the Gu-8 sing again, a torrent of rounds tearing the sky apart. The fighter erupted into flames, spiraling into the ground in a plume of smoke. "Two," she growled, eyes locked on the last pair. Maddox could barely breathe, his body battered, his mind spinning, but his voice came anyway, hoarse and defiant. "Finish it, Laura. Finish this." The night did not bring peace, only a darker kind of war. Smoke still hung in the air, illuminated by the flicker of distant fires as if the earth itself smoldered from the carnage. Ethan had not slept, not even for a moment. His body screamed for rest, but his mind remained locked in a relentless loop, replaying every image, every scream, every gunshot that had seared itself into his memory. The base they had secured earlier in the day felt less like a stronghold and more like a cage, a place where every wall could collapse with the next barrage. He sat with his back against a broken crate, rifle balanced across his knees, eyes burning but unblinking as he scanned the horizon. Around him, a few of the surviving men tried to find rest, their chests rising and falling in shallow sleep, but their dreams were not dreams, they were haunted murmurs, the subconscious cries of soldiers who had seen too much. He envied them, even their nightmares. He could not afford to close his eyes. He knew the enemy wasn't finished, not while their shadows moved in the valleys beyond. Somewhere out there, the war still plotted its next move and he would not be caught unaware. The silence between distant bursts of gunfire felt worse than the chaos itself. It was silence that carried the threat, silence that made every gust of wind against the sandbags sound like a boot scraping closer. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened with every creak of metal, every faint echo. Somewhere above, the clouds had thickened into a sheet of black, smothering the moon, hiding the stars. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the field until the world seemed reduced to only what he could touch with his hands. He tried to tell himself that the perimeter was secure, that the sentries they had posted were enough, but deep inside he knew better. The enemy wasn't reckless, they were calculating, waiting, choosing the perfect moment to strike. He shifted uncomfortably, his uniform stiff with blood and dust, the stink of cordite still trapped in the fibers. He was alive, but survival was beginning to feel like punishment, as though every second bought was another debt owed to the ghosts of the dead. His mind wandered to her, the A-10 pilot, the woman who had come roaring out of the heavens like vengeance itself. He hadn't even seen her face, just caught the thunder of her voice over the radio and the scream of her war machine as it tore the battlefield apart. Yet that sound, the A-10's gun, that terrible growl that split the night, had become the only proof he had that salvation was still possible. But even that proof was fragile. A machine, no matter how powerful, could not be everywhere at once. She was a force of destruction, yes, but she was also human. One pilot against an army bound by fuel, ammunition, and the limits of flesh and bone. Ethan thought of her in that cockpit, hands steady, eyes locked ahead, her body carried by the very same exhaustion that now tried to drag him under. How many times could she come back for them before the skies swallowed her too? How long before even that iron angel was silenced? His chest tightened at the thought, not with fear but with a kind of desperate admiration. She had changed the course of the battle once, pulled them from the jaws of death, but the war would not let either of them go so easily. He pushed the thought down and forced his breathing steady. The men around him needed him sharp, needed him unshaken. He could not falter, not while the night was still heavy with danger. A crack echoed in the dark. Not close, but near enough to snap Ethan upright, rifle raised, every nerve in his body blazing. He wasn't the only one. Others stirred, jerking awake, their own weapons lifted as eyes darted into the black. The sound had been unmistakable, a rifle shot from the ridges, somewhere beyond the wire. And then another, closer, tearing through the silence like a curse. The base came alive in an instant, voices shouting orders, boots pounding against dirt, and the faint glow of red flares launching skyward to paint the horizon in bloody light. In the flares' brief glare, Ethan saw them, shadows spilling over the ridge, dozens of them, maybe more, their silhouettes flickering like specters as they advanced. The enemy had chosen their moment. They were coming in waves, disciplined, relentless, and they were not here to probe the defenses this time. They were here to finish what had begun. Ethan threw himself into the fray, barking commands, dragging men into position behind sandbags and wreckage, every movement fueled not by hope but by grim necessity. His rifle barked, muzzle flashes tearing holes in the night, and for a heartbeat he thought maybe, just maybe, they could hold. But the enemy came harder. Mortars whistled overhead, slamming into the perimeter with bone-shaking blasts, throwing dirt and shrapnel like rain. The air filled with screams as men were torn apart, their cries lost in the thunder of explosions. Ethan hit the ground, ears ringing, teeth rattling from the force of the bombardment. His vision blurred, a haze of dust and blood painting the world in shades of hell. He crawled to cover, pulling a wounded soldier by the collar, dragging him behind a stack of sandbags before pressing down on the man's bleeding chest. "Stay with me," he shouted, though he couldn't even hear his own voice through the roar. But the soldier's eyes went glassy, his breath a rattle that faded into nothing. Ethan slammed his fist against the dirt, rage swallowing grief before it could even take root. There was no time to mourn, no space for weakness. He rose again, firing into the advancing tide, each trigger pull a vow that he would not fall quietly. The battle dissolved into chaos. Men ran, screamed, died. The line wavered, bent, and threatened to break under the sheer weight of the assault. Ethan fought like a man possessed, his rifle hot in his hands, barrel glowing as he cut down shapes in the dark. Yet for every enemy that fell, 3 more seemed to rise, their shadows endless. He felt the inevitability pressing in, that crushing certainty that this was not a battle but an execution. His legs ached, his arms shook, his lungs burned as smoke and dust clawed at his throat. Somewhere in the maelstrom, his radio crackled with broken voices, desperate calls for reinforcements, half-formed pleas drowned out by static. He wanted to believe someone would answer, that help was on its way, but the truth was bitter. They were alone. The base was collapsing. The night was theirs, and soon it would swallow him too. And then, just as the darkness threatened to consume everything, he heard it. Low at first, almost drowned by the roar of war, but unmistakable, the rumble of engines, a growl that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He froze, ears straining, eyes lifting toward the sky. The sound grew louder, closer, until it became the scream of a beast unleashed. His heart stuttered, breath caught in his chest as the night split open with the roar of an A-10. It came diving out of the clouds like a hawk from heaven, its silhouette cutting across the firelit horizon. The cannon spoke, a thunderous growl that chewed through the darkness, ripping the enemy ranks apart in fountains of dirt and flame. Ethan felt the shockwave pass through him as the Gu-8's fury painted the battlefield with destruction, lines of enemies shredded where they stood. Men who moments before had seemed unstoppable now scattered like insects beneath the wrath of that war machine. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, but to Ethan it was the sweetest sound in existence. The sound of salvation, of defiance, of vengeance brought back to life. He didn't need to see her face. He didn't need to know her name. The pilot was here again, their angel of iron, their shield against the inevitable. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the battle wasn't finished. Not yet. The desert night had fallen hard, swallowing the battlefield in shifting shadows and the low groan of the dying wind. Smoke curled from burning wrecks, the acrid scent clinging to every breath. Ryder crouched behind a half-buried dune buggy riddled with bullet holes, his rifle tight against his chest, sweat cutting rivers through the dust on his face. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat reminding him he was still alive, though barely. Around him, the shattered remnants of his unit lay silent, the echoes of their last stand drifting away into the infinite dark. For a moment, Ryder thought he was the last one breathing. That thought stung worse than the cut across his cheek, or the bruises blooming across his ribs. He had fought, clawed, and refused to go down, but the mercenary column pressing through the valley was endless, a river of armor and flesh, relentless and cold. Even when he broke their first line, another came. Even when he set ambushes that gutted their convoys, reinforcements poured in. And now, surrounded by flames, wreckage, and the stench of blood, he knew the enemy believed they had finally pinned him down. They were wrong because he heard it before they did. A sound that split the night like the tearing of the sky itself. At first it was distant, buried beneath the whine of the desert winds and the pop of scattered gunfire. Then it grew low and thunderous, a savage roar of turbines winding up into a scream that no man could mistake. Ryder's head snapped up, his battered heart hammering hope and disbelief together in his chest. It was impossible, it couldn't be, and yet every instinct told him the truth. She was here. The A-10. Her A-10. The angel of death in steel wings. The beast with a mouth that spat thunder. And piloting it, the one woman he had thought gone forever. The mercenaries noticed too, though too late. A spotlight swept across the battlefield, catching Ryder in its pale wash before it slid off, searching the ground. Shouts erupted among the enemy ranks, urgent voices barking over radios, commanders suddenly frantic. Vehicles roared to life, turrets swiveling skyward as the low, monstrous rumble swelled into the scream of engines tearing the silence apart. Ryder grinned, blood on his teeth, because he knew what was coming. They didn't. The first pass was a slaughter. The A-10 tore into the valley like a hunting hawk, its silhouette cutting across the stars, heavy wings carrying death. The G-8 Avenger cannon spun up, and the night shattered with a sound that was less gunfire and more apocalypse. Brrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr cans shredding flesh, steel and sand alike. Explosions blossomed across the valley floor, geysers of fire that threw men screaming into the air. Ryder ducked as a storm of earth and shrapnel rained down around him, but he couldn't stop laughing. It was wild, ragged, half-insane laughter, the laugh of a man who had been staring into the jaws of death only to see them crushed by something worse. His enemy's worse. His salvation. The warthog roared past overhead, engines glowing molten as it climbed. Ryder's eyes followed, every nerve in his body alive, every scar, every wound burning with renewed purpose. He whispered her name, half prayer, half plea. She was alive. She was here. Against every law of probability, every whisper of defeat, she had found him. And the mercenaries, once so confident, now scrambled like rats in firelight. Some fired their rifles uselessly at the sky, tracer rounds vanishing against her armor. Others tried to flee, vehicles grinding through sand in desperate retreat. But there was no escape. The A-10 wheeled in the sky, slow and deliberate as if savoring the kill. Ryder staggered to his feet, rifle slung, body screaming in protest. He limped through the wreckage toward higher ground, needing to see, needing proof she wasn't just a hallucination conjured by his dying mind. The earth shook again as another salvo tore through a convoy of armored trucks, the vehicles erupting into a chain of fireballs.